Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You know that feeling when the air in a room changes so suddenly that it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest? That was exactly what happened the moment my mother smirked across the Thanksgiving table, took a slow sip of her wine, and delivered a sentence so laced with entitlement and casual cruelty that it made my stomach clench. Your brother deserves the family home. He has a wife and kids to support. She said it so offhandedly, like it was an obvious fact that required no discussion, as if I, sitting right there with my husband beside me, was nothing more than a guest in my own family. For a moment, I thought I must have misheard her, that the clatter of plates and silverware or the hum of conversation had somehow warped her words in my ears. But no, the smug tilt of her chin, the way her eyes darted toward Jake, my golden child brother, confirmed that she meant exactly what she said. I felt a slow burn creeping up my spine, a mixture of disbelief and something dangerously close to anger. My husband, Daniel, barely hesitated before reaching for his glass and giving me a glance, the kind of glance that told me he was about to deliver something devastating. He tapped his glass lightly with his fork, let the silence stretch for a moment, and then said in a tone so calm it was almost mocking, "Funny, because we just bought it from Grandpa last week." The effect was instant. My mother's face lost every bit of color, her smirk collapsing into something closer to a stunned grimace, and across the table, Jake's fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against the plate with an ear-piercing clang. The rest of the family had gone utterly still, every conversation snuffed out like a candle, leaving only the thick, choking tension of a secret exposed at the worst possible moment. My mother's lips parted slightly, her breath hitching as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard, and for the first time in years, I saw something in her expression that resembled true shock. She recovered quickly, though, because of course she did. Margaret was nothing if not quick on her feet when it came to making sure things went her way. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head, her voice just a touch too sharp, like she was hoping to snap reality back into alignment through sheer force of will. "That house was supposed to go to Jake. Grandpa wouldn't." She stopped short, pressing her lips together so tightly they almost disappeared. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't actually spoken to Grandpa about it, had she? She had just assumed, just like always, that things would fall into place exactly as she expected them to. She had assumed that Jake, the golden son, the favorite, would inherit the home simply because that was the natural order of things in her mind. I took my time setting my fork down, dabbing at my lips with my napkin as if I wasn't suppressing the urge to laugh in her face. "Well, I guess Grandpa thought differently," I said, keeping my voice light, but not bothering to hide the satisfaction creeping into my words. "He reached out to us a few weeks ago and made the offer himself. We just closed on the sale last Friday." I watched as my mother's expression darkened, shifting from shock to something meaner, something uglier. "You went behind our backs," she accused, her voice gaining volume, the brittle edge of betrayal sharpening in her words. "You manipulated him." Across the table, Jake was still sitting in stunned silence, his hands clenched into fists on either side of his plate. His wife, Emily, shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing between us like she was desperate for an escape route, but Jake wasn't about to let this drop. Not when he was finally realizing that something he thought was his had slipped through his fingers. "That house has been in our family for generations," he said, his voice low and seething, barely contained. "You had no right to take it." That was what made me laugh, an actual sharp laugh that felt like a weight lifting off my chest. "No right?" I repeated, shaking my head as I leaned forward slightly. "It wasn't yours to begin with, Jake. You just assumed it would be handed to you, like everything else in your life." His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching, but before he could fire back, my mother slammed her wine glass down onto the table hard enough to make the liquid slosh over the rim. "This is a family decision," she snapped, her carefully cultivated mask of civility slipping just enough to show the raw frustration underneath. "You don't just make a choice like that without consulting us." I stared at her, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my chest. "Us? I repeated, my voice quieter now but no less pointed. You mean you and Jake? She had the nerve to look offended. Of course I do. The house was meant to stay with him, and why is that? I cut her off, not caring any more about keeping up appearances, not caring that we were in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner with an entire table of relatives watching the train wreck unfold in real time. Because he has kids? Because he's your favorite? Because you don't think I deserve something that's rightfully mine? The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unavoidable. My mother's mouth opened and closed once, twice, before she let out a sharp exhale and turned to Jake instead. We'll talk about this later, she said, like she could just press pause on reality and come back to it when it suited her. But she wasn't the one in control anymore. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it gently, a silent reassurance. He was right there with me, just like he had been since the moment we signed the papers. And as I looked at my mother's pale, furious face and Jake's barely restrained rage, I knew that this was far from over. Because if they thought they could just undo this, if they thought I would roll over and let them take what was mine, they had another thing coming. And trust me, this was just the beginning. The moment my mother recovered from the initial shock of learning that the house was no longer hers to give away, her expression twisted into something mean and calculating, her sharp eyes narrowing as she slammed her hands against the table. Her voice, usually measured and composed in front of guests, rose in both pitch and volume as she demanded to know how this had happened without her knowledge. Why would Grandpa sell the house to you? She spat, her face twisting in disbelief as she leaned forward, practically vibrating with fury. He knew it was meant to stay in the family, he knew Jake needed it, so why would he do something so? She cut herself off, biting down hard on whatever insult had been lingering on her tongue, but the meaning was clear enough. I didn't react immediately, because I wanted to enjoy the moment, the way her false sense of control was slipping right through her fingers like sand. Finally, I exhaled slowly, met her glare head-on, and said with absolute calm, because he wanted to. Because he made a decision for himself, for once, without you controlling it. The words hit her like a slap, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker across her face, something dangerously close to fear. I knew why. My mother had spent her entire life weaving a web of manipulation around everyone in her orbit, and Grandpa had been no exception. She must have assumed, as she always did, that he would bow to her wishes, that he would simply obey like he always had. But something had changed, and that realization was dawning on her in real time. Jake, who had been silent for a few moments too long, finally snapped out of his stunned daze and pushed his chair back from the table with enough force to make it scrape loudly against the floor. His face was bright red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and furious, dripping with resentment that had clearly been building for years. You stole my future, he seethed, his eyes burning into mine like he could somehow make me feel guilty for something that was never his in the first place. That house was supposed to be mine. Grandpa promised it to me when I was a kid. He said one day I'd have a family and that house would belong to me, just like it belonged to him. The weight of those words settled in my chest, not because I believed them, but because they revealed something deeper than just entitlement. Jake had genuinely believed, for his entire life, that he was owed this house, that it was some birthright passed down through the generations with his name etched into its foundation. He didn't see it as a home to be earned, as something Grandpa had the right to sell. He saw it as something that had always been his, just waiting for the day he would collect it like a prize. I stared at him for a long moment before speaking, my voice measured but firm, letting each word sink into the tense silence of the room. You can't steal something that was never yours, I said, watching as his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack under the pressure. Grandpa made his own decision. He chose to sell it. You being angry about it doesn't change that. Jake let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He was old, he shot back, his tone laced with accusation, with an implication that I wasn't about to let slide. You manipulated him, didn't you? You tricked an old man into signing away something he didn't even understand he was giving up. That hit a nerve, and I felt my fingers tighten around the napkin in my lap as my stomach twisted into knots of frustration and anger. "That's rich," I muttered under my breath, just loud enough for the table to hear, before pushing my chair back and standing up to meet him head-on. I manipulated him? That's funny, considering I wasn't the one pressuring him to sign over the house to someone who only saw it as a financial asset. That was when my mother finally moved, rising from her seat so abruptly that her wine glass tipped, spilling deep red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. But she didn't even glance at it, too focused on the conversation, too desperate to regain control of the situation before it slipped further from her grasp. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the dining room, heading down the hall toward the study with sharp, determined strides. Daniel, who had been silent for most of the argument, his hand resting reassuringly on mine, finally spoke in a voice that was lower but no less firm. "Where's she going?" he asked, his gaze following her retreating figure with a quiet sort of suspicion. Jake let out another bitter laugh, shaking his head before crossing his arms over his chest. "Oh, I know exactly where she's going," he said, and though his voice carried the same anger as before, there was something else beneath it now, something like unease. "She's getting the will." The room seemed to collectively hold its breath at those words, and I felt my stomach drop in the way it does just before something terrible happens. Of course she was. Of course she had something up her sleeve. And I had a feeling that whatever she was about to pull out of that study was going to change everything. My mother returned from the study with her chin lifted, her hands clutching a thick, slightly worn folder as if it contained the irrefutable proof she needed to dismantle everything I had just said. Without hesitation, she marched straight back to the head of the table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that felt like a countdown to something I wouldn't like. When she reached her seat, she slammed the folder down onto the table so forcefully that several glasses trembled from the impact, a few drops of red wine sloshing onto the white tablecloth, staining it like blood. "There," she declared triumphantly, her voice sharp and unwavering, her eyes daring me to challenge what she was about to say. "That's the real will, the one that should matter, the one that was written before you decided to worm your way into Grandpa's head and make him question his own decisions." She flipped open the folder with a flick of her wrist, pulling out several stapled pages, yellowed at the edges, but still crisp enough to be legible. "This," she continued, tapping the top page with a manicured finger, "is Grandpa's will from 10 years ago. In it, he clearly states that the house goes to Jake. No questions, no last-minute deals, no manipulations, just a simple fact." For a moment, nobody spoke, the only sound in the room the faint rustling of the pages as she spread them out, her movements precise and controlled. My brother, who had been fuming ever since I revealed the truth, suddenly looked victorious again, his arms uncrossing as he leaned in, scanning the document with barely concealed satisfaction. His wife, Emily, who had been silent this whole time, let out a small, relieved breath as if this entire situation had just been magically reversed with the slap of a few papers on a table. But I wasn't rattled. Not even a little. I folded my arms, tilting my head as I studied my mother, who was watching me like a hawk, waiting for me to crumble under the weight of her so-called evidence. When I didn't, her eyes narrowed, the first glimmer of unease flashing across her face. "You look awfully calm for someone who just got caught," she muttered, her lips pressing together in a thin, tight line. Daniel, who had been silent for a while, exhaled slowly before leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table as he surveyed the documents with an air of curiosity rather than alarm. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice as even and level as ever, though there was a distinct sharpness beneath the surface. "That will was written 10 years ago? Before Jake was even married? Before he had kids? Before any of us knew what the future would look like?" My mother hesitated, but only for a second before she straightened her shoulders and gave a curt nod. "Yes, and that proves exactly what I've been saying," she replied swiftly, her voice picking up momentum again as if she was trying to outrun logic. "Grandpa always intended for the house to stay in the family, to go to the child who would build a life inside of it. He never planned for some last-minute switch, and he certainly never planned for you to swoop in and take it out from under your brother. I let out a slow breath, feeling something cold settle in my chest, something familiar, something I had known my whole life, but had never fully confronted until now. My mother wasn't upset because she thought Grandpa had been manipulated. She was upset because, for the first time, she hadn't been the one pulling the strings. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone with deliberate slowness, the motion making her frown deepen. "You keep saying Grandpa never planned to change things," I said, my voice quieter now, more controlled, letting each word land like a weight against the silence of the room. "But if that's true, then why did he record this?" Before she could react, before she could throw up another wall of excuses or lies, I pressed play. Grandpa's voice crackled through the speakers, old but steady, worn but clear, filling the dining room with a presence that no one had expected. I changed my will because I finally saw the truth about my daughter and her golden boy. The words hung heavy in the air, slicing through the tension like a blade, sending a ripple of discomfort through every single person sitting at that table. My mother paled instantly, her fingers twitching as she clutched the tablecloth, her nails digging into the fabric as though she could physically hold herself together through sheer force. Jake looked like he had been sucker-punched, his mouth slightly open, his brow furrowed in an expression that was half confusion and half something dangerously close to guilt. "I always thought I was doing the right thing," Grandpa's voice continued, unwavering despite the faint tremor of age. "I thought Margaret had Jake's best interests at heart, that she was looking out for him the way a mother should. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." My mother abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her expression wild and desperate as she shook her head. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch, her composure shattering piece by piece. "You expect me to believe that he just, what? Changed his mind because of something you said? Because of something you did?" Jake, however, didn't speak. He was sweating now, his fingers twitching as if his body was betraying him, his own nervous system reacting to something deeper than just shock. I watched him carefully, noting the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, the way his eyes darted toward my mother, seeking some sort of reassurance that wasn't coming. "You want the truth?" he suddenly blurted, his voice rough, raw, like he had been holding something back for far too long and could no longer keep it contained. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." The room fell so deathly silent that I could hear the faintest ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound I had never even noticed before, but now seemed impossibly loud. I didn't know what he was about to say, but I could feel it in my bones. Whatever came next was going to change everything. For a moment, it seemed as if my brother might actually choke on whatever words were fighting their way up his throat, his whole body rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between me and our mother like he was calculating exactly how much damage he was about to cause. The weight of silence pressed down so heavily that I could hear the soft, uneven breathing of people around the table, could see my mother's fingers gripping the edge of the tablecloth as if steadying herself against the impact of whatever was coming next. Jake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and then, almost in a whisper, almost as if the words themselves carried more weight than he could bear, he finally said, "Grandpa didn't just change his will because of you." He hesitated, exhaled sharply, and then, with something dangerously close to regret, added, "He changed it because he found out the truth about Mom and me." The entire room seemed to contract around those words, every single person suddenly hanging on the edge of something none of us had expected. I saw the moment my mother realized what he was about to say, the precise second she lost whatever control she thought she still had, because her whole body went stiff, her mouth opened like she wanted to interrupt, to stop him before he could go any further. But it was already too late. Jake ran a hand through his hair, breathing heavily now, as though the pressure of keeping this secret had been eating away at him for so long that finally speaking it out loud was physically painful. "We were going to sell the house," he admitted, his voice hoarse, his gaze flickering to me, to Daniel, and then back to my mother like he was seeking some last-minute justification for what he had done. "Not after Grandpa passed. not with his blessing behind his back while he was still alive. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, something deeper than anger, something that reached into the very core of what it meant to be betrayed by your own family. The house wasn't just property, wasn't just some asset to be cashed in, it was where we had grown up, where our grandparents had built their lives, where every childhood Christmas, every scraped knee, every Sunday dinner had taken place. And yet, here Jake was, admitting that he had planned to get rid of it like it was nothing, like it was just another financial transaction. My mother's breath hitched, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw real fear in her eyes, real panic clawing its way up to the surface. "You had no right to dig into that," she snapped, her voice shaking slightly despite the venom laced into her words, her carefully constructed mask finally beginning to slip. I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I met her gaze, refusing to back down even as the weight of this revelation pressed heavily against my chest. I didn't have to dig, I told her, watching as her expression twisted further, her composure fracturing piece by piece. "Grandpa figured it out himself. He heard you and Jake talking about it, heard you making plans to put him in a cheaper nursing home so you could get rid of the house and split the money." The moment those words left my mouth, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted, the tension thick enough to choke on, the air so heavy with unspoken accusations that it felt like something living, something tangible. My mother's face drained of color, her mouth opening slightly before snapping shut again, her lips pressing together so tightly that they practically disappeared. Jake looked miserable now, his earlier anger crumbling into something that looked an awful lot like shame. But whether that shame was for what he had done or for the fact that he had been caught, I couldn't be sure. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing myself to remain calm even as my heart pounded violently against my ribs. "That's why he called me," I said, my voice quieter now, more measured, but no less sharp. "He told me everything, told me how disgusted he was, how heartbroken he felt knowing that the people he had trusted the most were the ones who were planning to throw him away like an inconvenience." I looked directly at my mother now, daring her to deny it, daring her to continue spinning whatever web of lies she thought she could still hold together. "That's why he changed the will. Not because I manipulated him, not because I tricked him, but because he finally saw you for who you really are." Jake let out a shaky breath, raking a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted, like whatever anger had been fueling him had finally burned out, leaving behind only regret. "Mom told me you didn't want the house," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now, his words carrying the kind of weary disbelief that only comes from realizing just how deeply you've been played. "She told me you wouldn't fight for it, that you didn't care about it the way I did, that you—" He stopped, shaking his head, exhaling slowly as if trying to make sense of everything that had just unraveled in front of him. "I thought I was just taking what was supposed to be mine." My mother shot him a sharp look, her panic morphing into something closer to rage, but it was too late to stop him now. He had already said too much, had already cracked the illusion she had so carefully constructed, and now there was no going back. I studied her for a long moment, watched the way she clenched her fists against the table, the way her breathing had turned shallow, uneven, the way she was scrambling to come up with some new version of the truth that might still save her. But there was no saving this, no walking back what had just been exposed. She wasn't just playing favorites with my brother, wasn't just favoring him because of some old-fashioned belief that the oldest son deserved more. She had been actively trying to erase me from the family's legacy, to cut me out of everything, to make sure I was left with nothing. I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me, something final. "You made your choice, Mom," I said, my voice steady now, stronger than before, filled with the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. "And now you'll live with it." The silence that followed was deafening, stretching across the table like an open wound, raw and unhealed. And then, just when I thought there was nothing left to say, just when I thought the final blow had been dealt, Daniel reached into his jacket, his expression unreadable, and pulled out one last piece of paper. I had no idea what it was, but from the way my mother's entire body tensed, From the way Jake suddenly looked sick to his stomach, I knew whatever was on that paper was going to destroy whatever fragile defenses they still had left. The entire room felt frozen in time, the weight of everything that had just been revealed pressing down like a suffocating blanket, trapping everyone in place, making it impossible to escape the truth that now lay bare on the table for all to see. My mother sat stiffly in her chair, her usually composed expression betraying something deeper, something raw and shaken, something that told me she knew that this was the moment where everything slipped from her grasp, where all the careful planning, all the manipulation, all the control she had wielded for years had finally collapsed in on itself. Jake, still reeling from his own confession, looked between us with something close to desperation, as if he was searching for some way to claw back the future he had always assumed was his without question. And then, without a single word, Daniel reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, moving with the kind of slow deliberation that made every second stretch unbearably long. My mother's eyes snapped to his hands immediately, narrowing with suspicion, her fingers tightening against the edge of the table as if she was bracing herself for whatever was about to come next. He pulled out a crisp manila envelope, set it down with a quiet but deliberate thud, and slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of her. The silence stretched impossibly thick, unbroken except for the sound of my mother's shallow, uneven breaths. "What is this?" she finally asked, her voice lower now, almost wary, as if she already knew she wasn't going to like the answer. Daniel exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze with the kind of unwavering calm that had always made him so much harder to rattle than anyone else in this family. "That," he said, his voice steady but firm, "is the final contract Grandpa signed before he passed." He paused just long enough to let those words sink in, just long enough to watch the color drain ever so slightly from her face before he continued. "Not only did he sell us the house, but he also transferred all of his remaining assets to your daughter." The words landed like a bomb in the middle of the table, detonating with silent devastation, sending an invisible shockwave through every person sitting there, changing the entire landscape of this conversation in an instant. My mother's mouth parted slightly, her carefully constructed facade finally beginning to shatter, her eyes scanning Daniel's face as if hoping to find some sign that this was a lie, some indication that she could still find a way to salvage what she had just lost. Jake let out a sharp exhale, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his entire body going tense as if he had been physically struck. "What?" Jake's voice was barely more than a whisper, but there was something jagged beneath it, something splintering and raw, something that was teetering dangerously close to collapse. He blinked rapidly, his face twisting in disbelief, shaking his head once, twice, as if doing so might somehow erase the words that had just been spoken into existence. "That's not possible." "There's no way Grandpa would." He stopped himself, cutting off his own sentence as something shifted behind his eyes, some horrible realization settling in, some belated understanding that no amount of denial was going to change what had already been done. "Oh, but he did," I said, my voice quieter now, my hands folding neatly in my lap, my expression unreadable as I watched the last remnants of their delusions crumble to dust. "He made sure that neither of you would see a single cent of his estate. Every dime from the house sale, every remaining asset, every last thing he had left, he gave it all to me." I tilted my head slightly, watching my mother with open curiosity now, waiting for her to respond, waiting for the full weight of those words to settle into her bones, to sink into her chest, to burn into her memory the way her betrayals had burned into mine. For the first time in my life, I saw her truly break. Her breath came faster now, uneven and sharp, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the envelope as if touching it might change the reality she was now being forced to confront. She opened it with stiff, jerky movements, pulling out the crisp stack of papers inside, scanning them with wide, desperate eyes, searching for some loophole, some flaw, some mistake that would let her unravel this, undo what had already been set in stone. But there was nothing. Jake exhaled sharply, running both hands over his face as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing, his entire body rigid with disbelief. "This isn't fair," he muttered, shaking his head again, his voice dripping with frustration, with something dangerously close to self-pity. This isn't how things were supposed to happen. And that was what finally made me laugh. The sound escaped before I could stop it, sharp and bitter and filled with something deeper than amusement, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Fair? I repeated, arching an eyebrow as I let the word linger between us, let it settle like a weight against the air. Was it fair when you tried to cut me out of my own family's history? Was it fair when you planned to steal from Grandpa before he was even gone? Was it fair when you assumed, without question, that you were the only one who ever mattered? I shook my head slowly, exhaling through my nose as I rose from my seat, smoothing my hands down the front of my dress as I turned to Daniel, whose eyes flickered with silent understanding. Dinner's over. I took my husband's hand without looking back, walking away from the table with measured, deliberate steps, feeling the weight of years of resentment finally beginning to lift from my shoulders. The house was mine. The truth was out. There was nothing left for them to take. As I reached the doorway, just as I was about to step into the hallway and leave them to sit in the ruins of their own making, I heard my mother's voice, quiet this time, hoarse and fractured, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough that the words sent a strange chill down my spine. "I never thought you'd do this to us." For the briefest moment, I paused, my fingers tightening slightly around Daniel's, my chest rising and falling with a slow, steady breath. And then, without turning around, without sparing her even a glance, I simply said the only thing that mattered anymore. "Funny," I murmured, my voice steady, unwavering, final. "I was thinking the same thing about you." And then I walked away, leaving them in the wreckage they had built for themselves, knowing, finally, completely, that I had won.